I want to show you a movement that started for the last decade that drew from social psychology into trying to understand philosophy a little bit better. And this has a lot to do with my journey. So this is the stuff that I've done my PhD on, even though it was in a business school of all places. I did a lot of things that have to do with philosophy. So I want to share some of these things with you to hope that it gives you a sense of meaning, or to try and understand how we can apply social psychology methods, judgment making methods, to understand philosophy, who we are, what is free will, what is our true self, what is our essential self, how do we think about the world and us in a social environment. So I'll start from something that's dates back for a very long time. So we have to go back to ancient Greece. But then came these big philosophers who, for the first time, tried to think about the world and try to understand the world using scientific means. And I think all of their statements, if you go back and you read what it is that these people did 2,500 years ago, it just blows your mind. So starting from Democritus, just look at this sentence. It has so much meaning. It's just unbelievable that somebody at that time was able to say this kind of thing. But the first principles of the universe, or the understanding of the universe, are atoms and empty space. Wow. So back then he didn't know anything about the world, but somehow he came up with this. So we used the language of atoms in order to later discover what atoms actually are. Empty space. Everything else is merely thought to exist. What is he talking about? About gods. Are there really gods? We don't really know. They're thought to exist, but maybe it's not a reality. So he's very controversial, especially for his time, saying, oh, we should reconsider this whole thing with gods. Actually, it all comes down to science, and everything is predetermined. Everything has to do with atoms and empty space and what is it that actually exists in the universe. So physics, in a way. Then on the other side, you've got Epicurus, big figure, very fundamental writings, and then he writes about something that is mind-blowing. Whereas our own actions are autonomous. It's not the gods that tell us what to do or determine the way that we are. We have the capacity. We're independent from them. We can choose our own path. And it is to them that praise and blame naturally attach. So he's combining two different things. He's talking about free will, autonomy on one side, and then he's talking about moral accountability. He's saying because we're autonomous, because we're not determined by God, because we're in charge of our own path, this is why when we do something good, then we deserve praise. When we do something bad, then we deserve blame. So he's the one who's making this kind of connection. It might seem natural to you to think about this connection, but back then it was not really the case. Everything that you did determined by gods. You had very little choice or ability to execute your own will. It's not just in the West, but at the same time, almost 3rd century BC, you've got some Chinese philosophers talking about this, and this is even more mind-blowing to me to read these kinds of things. It's like mind is the ruler. It's not all these gods that you have around you. It's not even the emperor that tells you how to think about things, but it's the ruler of one's body and the master of one's spirit and intelligence. It does all kinds of things. It forbids oneself, orders oneself voluntarily, takes away, voluntarily chooses, moves oneself, stops oneself. It can be said what the mind works in such a way that its choice and clearly displays itself because, and this is amazing, nothing hinders the mind from making a choice. So you've got ultimate free will. You can decide what is your path, what you want to do. So that's a big words coming, especially given that time and how people used to think back then. I grew up in a Jewish culture back in Israel, and this was a big thinker in the Jewish thinking kind of way. So one of the big philosophers of the Jewish thinking back then is this rabbi, Akiva. And I grew up with the sentence, and I always was puzzled by the sentence because I didn't understand how this works exactly. So Judaism obviously believes in a God, and this God is all-seeing and all-knowing. But Judaism has something about free will. And then there's this very strange sentence. All is foreseen. It means that God sees everything. God knows everything about your future and everything that you're going to do. But freedom is granted, still gives you the ability to choose. So how could it be that we both have everything determined? So God knows everything, but then we also have free will. How does this coexist? So that's when philosophers moved from is there free will or there isn't free will to something a little bit more complicated where you can have both determinism. So determinism is either true or false. And you have free will that either exists or doesn't exist. And it's okay that both of this exist at the same time. For a layperson, especially me as a kid, it's like, what do you mean? Doesn't it mean that if he knows everything, I don't have free will? He already knows what I'm going to decide. So do I really have a choice? But actually, when you think about this, there's a whole group of compatibilists. So in philosophy, there are most of the philosophers endorse both of these, saying that we do follow the laws of physics, but we do have free will in the sense that we can choose from different options. We have the capacity to choose from different options. And then there's like hard determinists or libertarians or hard incompatibilists. So you have this dimension, and then it has a bit more of a nuance regarding philosophy. So philosophy entered a new stage where free will does not necessarily mean indeterminism. So starting from back from Greece through the Eastern regions to religions and um, more modern um, more modern religions that believe in one God, then we have Judaism. It became a very heated debate. So that went on for a while, 2,000 years. But it's amazing that after 2,000 years, we haven't made much progress, and we're still debating this. So when you look at the literature today in neuroscience and biology, you've got still this debate between, is free will possible? Where did it come from? And free will is not possible. It's an illusion. So you've got people like Sam Harris, who wrote a few books. Now he's a big podcaster with millions of subscriptions that argues free will is an illusion. You've got the Libet experiments that try to show that, things firing up in the brain actually predict what people say afterwards. So it seems like almost people's feelings are determined by the neurons firing in the brain in regards to all kinds of things. So many at the time when Libet came out with these things thought that this says that there's actually no free will, and we think that we have free will, but actually everything is predetermined. There's lots of controversy over all of that, but definitely a lot of neuroscientists tend to believe that everything is determined and there's like any free will is an illusion. Then on the other side, I was very surprised that actually some biologists and neuroscientists think that free will does exist, and actually they also offer an evolutionary perspective of why free will actually came to be. So there's an evolutionary explanation for this, and it's a very long and complicated story, but I'll shorten this to just say that what they say is the reason why we survived all the predators that were around us, the lions and the tigers, is because the lions and the tigers are very good at hunting things that are predictable. So they know exactly where you're going to go. So they study you and then they chase you. And then because you're predictable, they know how to overcome you. But the thing with humans is that humans develop the capacity to be unpredictable. So unpredictability allows for more freedom to evade the patterns that you are born with in order to come up with new patterns in order to escape something like a lion or a tiger. So evolutionary, in order to survive as a species, we had to come up with things that are unpredictable in order to evade predators. Very interesting debate. I don't know much about this. I don't know much about neuroscience, but it's interesting to see this kind of back and forth between these two sides. If we get to something that's a bit more social psychology related, I think many of you probably are familiar with Skinner. So behaviorism, so everything is stimulus and response. In between, it's a black box, and it doesn't really matter what the black box is because we can study human behavior. We can study everything just using stimulus and response. So free will just is irrelevant. You can just take it out of the equation. And then lots of people came afterwards. We discussed a little bit of these findings. Not very credible. Social priming does not hold up. But back then, John Barge was an advocate of these things. Daniel Wagner, unfortunately, passed away, but he was a big proponent about free will being an illusion and made some good arguments about that. So you've got this camp coming in psychology. Over here on this side, we've got Roy Baumeister arguing that free will exists. And it's amazing what he writes here. I was a little bit blown away to see that he wrote it this way. So the question is, do you really have free will? And then he says, of course you do. And this is how it evolved. And then he tells the story of where free will came from. So his main argument, we're going to meet him later on. There's a video from him in order for you to get to know him. But one of the things that he argues is that we're social animals. He's the one who built in the concept of self-control. So where the self-control comes from. So he says we all have our inner urgent needs, desires. So we're built with this. They were biologically driven, but self-control overrides those needs. So by having self-control, you're able to exercise free will in order to overcome who you are as an animal to turn us into social animals where we can coexist together with society. It has a very unique perspective on free will that deviates from many other researchers. But what was interesting for me is I was thinking about what I want to do my PhD on is like, can we do anything different? So rather than discussing whether free will is real or not, we can study whether people believe that they have free will. So moving from this big debate to examining what do people think, do they have, do they not have, and then what are the consequences of this? How does this affect their cognition? How does this affect their behavior at the end? And I joined when I was there with Baumeister in Florida State University. There was a big group of experimental philosophers. So the X-Files with Josh Knob, Sean Nichols, and Eddie Namias. they formed together this new movement in the 2010, 2011 to bring experimental philosophy, bring X-Files into something of a movement to try and embed social psychology experimental methods into trying to understand things like free will, like philosophy. So they say, a bit like I did during my PhD, is like free will might exist, might not exist, doesn't matter, but lay beliefs, whether people believe in this or not, is what we should be interested in. So we should try and understand what is it that they believe, how do they define free will, how do they come to believe in free will, what increases or decreases the level of belief in free will. So we can start from like very simple experiments. I'm going to show you what was the first big experimental philosophy kind of experiment that brought everything up. You can scan this or you can go to the Mentimeter and put that code over there. I'm going to read this out to you. I'm going to describe two universes to you. So these universes are exactly the same thing aside from one different parameter. It's a little bit like you're doing with your charities, charity A and charity B, just instead of charity, we're doing universes. So what experimental philosophers try and do is to get you to imagine a world where something happens or doesn't happen or happens a certain way. So we're going to start with this very vague description of a universe. So imagine a universe, universe A, in which almost everything that happens is completely caused by everything that happened before it. What is the one exception? Human decision making, right? So everything is determined, but human decision making is not. So we are not determined. We are indeterministic. For example, one day John decided to have French fries at lunch. Since the person's decision in this universe is not completely caused by what happened before it, even if everything in the universe was exactly the same up till John made his decision, it did not have to happen that John would have decided to have French fries. He could have chosen to eat something different. Okay, so that's one of those. So in here, I'm asking you to rate all kinds of things. First, universe A, how realistic is this? How similar is this to our universe? Does this describe our universe? So on 0 to 100. And then we've got another very important question. So this association between, so Epicurus, who made this connection between free will and moral accountability. So in this world, can people be held morally responsible for their actions? And then question to you, it's a personal preference. We want to know, how happy would you be to live in this kind of universe? And finally, this is the Rohr Baumeister perspective. So how is free will related to us being social animals and helping each other and surviving together in a society? How pro-social are people in this universe? Okay. So this gives you an idea of one of the universes. Now I'm going to show you another universe. So you can contrast this to the other universe. Typically, of course, when we run this in an experiment, we randomize whether you see universe A or universe B. So this is the second one. Imagine a universe, universe B, in which everything, not almost everything, but everything that happens is completely caused by everything that happened before it. This is true from the very beginning of the universe. So what happened in the beginning of the universe caused what happened next, and so on, right until the very present. For example, one day John decided to have French fries at lunch. Like everything else, this decision was predetermined, completely caused by everything that happened before it. So if everything in this universe was exactly the same up until John made his decision, then it had to happen. There was no other choice that John would have decided to have French fries. Okay? And then we have very similar questions on the same rank, realism, morally responsible, and so forth. So you can already try and see and contrast these two. How realistic, which one of those is more realistic, and then you can try and make some assessment, which one is closer to what we are, which one has the link to moral accountability, and so forth. So these are the two scenarios against each other. And I just want to show you that actually this little scenario started a revolution of experimental psychology. Because Sean Nichols, that we saw from before, came out with this very simple vignette trying to say, we're going to start a new movement trying to understand philosophical principles like free will using experimental philosophy. Okay, so quite remarkable. What did they do? So you can see over here that they had indeterministic versus deterministic universes. And then they had low affect and high affect. I'll get to this in a second. But already you can see that we have moral responsibility here and you can see that people in the indeterministic universe that allows for free will show much higher, very close to 100% moral accountability, whereas in determinism, it goes a lot lower than that, right? So this is already a main effect that is very interesting. So this link that we saw from Epicurus about saying that free will is a link to moral accountability, free will might allow for moral accountability. But then there was like another very curious thing that they found out. So they did the high affect versus low affect. So what is low affect? What is high affect? French fries. Somebody eating a French fries. We don't really care much about this. How about somebody who committed murder? We really care about that. That is something that we really are offended by. So that leads us to experience high affect of being angry at this or wanting to hold somebody accountable, punishing. So already in the indeterministic universe, it was already high, but when somebody behaved very badly with high affect, it brought it very close to 100. And here, even when there's a deterministic universe, when we see somebody behaving badly, we want to hold them accountable for their actions. Therefore, we stop believing in free will. And there's this big difference between these two. It kind of jumps up to over 60% because we want to be able to hold people accountable. Because if it's deterministic and people say, I had no choice, God made me do this, or the universe made me do this, then everybody's just going to go around behaving badly all day, right? So people need to have something in order to allow them to punish others. There comes the question of free will is a very complicated notion. People have a different concept of what free will is. Sometimes it gets lost in translation. So actually in Hebrew, that I know as a native language, it has a slightly different meaning. I've been told that with Chinese, the way that people translate this has a different meaning. So you want to have a definition that anybody across all the fields, regardless of what they believe in, can agree on, whether you're deterministic, indeterministic, or whether you're compatibilist. So you believe in both free will and determinism at the same time. So back then in 2011, 12, at Florida State, they had this big conference where they got experimental philosophers and social psychologists together in one room to try and decide, okay, what's a good definition of free will? And it was a heated debate. Finally, they agreed on the capacity to perform free actions. You got like what? They didn't make any progress because you still need to define what free actions are. But then we were able, after some negotiations, to say, okay, what free actions are? The acting agents could have chosen to do otherwise. And then comes the question, what does it mean? Could have chosen to do otherwise. So two parameters. First, that there are other options available to that person. If there are no other options, then there's no choice, right? But then also the capacity to freely choose among those options, to be free from both internal and external constraints. So what is internal constraints? It's all these things that Roy Baumeister was talking about. So all those urges, your needs, your desires, maybe even your personality, your background, all the things that are within you that try to force you to do a certain thing, to try to control you, to tell you this is what you must do. What are external constraints? It could be anything that comes from the environment. This is the social environment that we study. So it could be family, friends, society, could be the universe, could be gods, angels, demons. All these are external ones. So freedom from them, the capacity to do this without external coercion. Nobody's holding a gun to your head telling you you must do this, right? So it's already making some progress. It's allowing us to move from all sorts of other things that people were thinking about. So mind and body dualism, that mind is separated from the body. Kahneman with thinking fast and slow. So system one, automatic, immediate. There's no processing. And then only in system two do you have deliberation. You have the ability to override system one. So this dualistic notion, we're trying to move away from that into something that's a bit more. And one of the first things that I wrote and published was about trying to define free will. So what is this? Making sense of agency, and the belief in free will is something that is important. And I just referred to this conference that we had back in 2011, 12 to really that the person could have chosen to do otherwise or to choose among the options without any constraints. When we ask people, what do you believe is free will? What does free will mean to you? So 74 talk about freedom from internal external constraints, and 41 talk about choice. Then we have over here the ability to make a decision or a choice. So free will is not this metaphysical, not something that is out there with the gods and dualism, or something that is meta that goes beyond our existence, but something that is very practical about the way that we make decisions. Do we have the ability to make decisions or not? Also, a few good students joined me along the way. So a Hong Kong student that did not do her PhD in Hong Kong, her master's, Alison, did a systematic review, and it was amazing. She wrote on our HKU Psychology Today column, this one, Chasing the Free Will Rabbit, A Journey in Open Science. So she joined us, she learned from us how to do a systematic review, and she started. So she looked at how everybody is writing about free will, and she looked at 36 studies with 10,000 participants from all kinds of regions, United States, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Turkey, and Germany. And she tried to show that actually this definition of free will is shared among different cultures. It's a very well done thesis of a systematic review by somebody who worked with us to implement open science and do some work on free will. For my own review, I was trying to make the point that there's something new about free will beliefs, because whenever I would, even when I came to HKU to do a job talk, when they wanted to see if they want to hire me or not, so they were asking me, but what's new about this? Like, we've had different constructs. So maybe you've heard of locus of control, maybe you heard of self-efficacy, self-esteem, you heard of implicit theories, mindsets, all these things. So what's different about free will? Here, like, I map things out and show that there's something very important about free will that is very different from the other constructs. And all this comes from experimental philosophy, but also embeds with it social psychology kind of methods. So I'll give you just one example of one of the experiments that I did, one of the first ones that I did. So basically what we did is that we had 3 different universes. So I took the classic universes of deterministic universe and the indeterministic universe, but then I added another control condition. I thought maybe people just don't know. Maybe people just say indeterministic is higher because they are not sure what kind of universe this is. So I gave them another universe. And the universe says, actually, we don't know if it's indeterministic or deterministic. And I asked them, which one of these universes are the most similar to the universe that you're in right now? And I was blown away, because in terms of realism, it's not that people have doubts. People really think that this is an indeterministic. They do this with a lot of confidence. They say, it's not that we don't know. We know exactly this is an indeterministic universe. So they rate the indeterministic as being the highest realism, the closest to our reality. So many of the people are very indeterministic. They believe in the capacity for choice. But then the question is, why do they do this? So we measured many other kinds of things. We measured happiness, learning, meaningfulness, uniqueness, prosociality. So this is the Baumeister, future orientation, and moral accountability, responsibility. And you can see that across all of those, people just see that there's more happiness, more meaning, more responsibility, accountability, prosociality, more future in the indeterministic one. So there's lots of reasons why people come to prefer and believe in an indeterministic universe over the uncertain and deterministic universe. So it was a really interesting to see just how strong all these effects are. Trying to understand, why do people believe in free will? What causes that? So I'll just show you one practical implications for that. And this is a very curious case study that I saw during my PhD, and I thought might be interesting for you to contemplate. It's a very long kind of scenario, but I'll summarize this for you. So there's this guy. So there's this guy, and he's driving drunk, and he's been pulled to stop on the side by a police officer. And the police officer measures with the breath test whether he's drunk or not, and the guy can barely walk. So it's very, very clear that the guy is absolutely drunk. He's not in control of everything that he's doing, especially not driving. So what does the police officer do? The police officer puts him in cuffs so he cannot move, and basically just drags him, because he can barely walk. He drags him to the patrol car, and then he takes him to custody, to jail, where he's awaiting to see a judge, a court. So all this happens fine. So he goes into the jail, and then at some point he's starting to urinate on himself. So they take him to the toilet, and when he's in the toilet trying to just like manage his stuff, suddenly out of his pocket come out some drugs. And it's already an offense to carry drugs, back then at least in the US. Now it's a little bit more free in some states, but back then this was an offense that might get you 15 days in jail. However, if they find drugs on you when you're in jail, it means that you brought in drugs to the jail. It goes up to 8 months. And the question was, how much time should this Barnes guy serve in jail? Should he serve 15 days for drug possession? Sorry, not 5 days, 15 days for drug possession, or should he be charged with 8 months of possession for bringing drugs into the jail? So what should he be convicted for? So back then, so the headline, I saw this headline, I thought this is terrific. So the North Carolina Supreme Court hears a case about drugs, urine, and free will. So I was trying to keep track of all the cases that involve the notion of free will. So this is kind of like the summary. Taken to jail by the police for drunk driving. He barely was capable of walking. While he's in jail, found that he had concealed drugs, and then he was charged with drugs in prison 8 months, which is harsher than the drugs possession. Is he guilty of the 8 months, or should he be getting 15 days? So that's the case that I bring to you. If they found the drugs when he was in jail, then he brought the drugs into the jail, therefore he's guilty. Or maybe because he was not in control, because he was completely drunk, because he was handcuffed and brought into the jail, regardless of his choice, maybe that means that he's not responsible for this and he should not be held accountable for bringing it to jail. Did he have any other choice? So interesting case study. I'm curious to see what you'll say about this. So many of you say, not many, half. Okay, so 15 days, about half, you're split in between, about 15 days for drug possession or eight months. So very interesting. I'll just tell you that at the end, the final result was that it was brought as an appeal, went all the way up to the Supreme Court of North Carolina to override the jury response. And finally, when the judges discussed this, they had 3 judges, and 2 out of the 3 judges decided that he is deserving of 8 months. And they wrote this, he's guilty because Barnes knew he was in possession of weed inside the jail. He was responsible for it. And they argued that he should have handed these concealed drugs prior to his arrival. Thing is, the guy could barely process anything. So it's not really clear whether, even if he knew, maybe he forgot about this, but even if he knew, it was not clear that he would be able to process the information that he needs to tell the officer that he has drugs, so he's not held accountable for those. But what's interesting is I really like this dissenting opinion. So one judge, this Judge Linda, she argued that because Barnes was brought into the jail involuntarily, he's not guilty of the enhanced charge. She wrote, he had no ability to choose his own course of action regarding his location. Really fascinating case study. And what I liked about this is all the keywords of how they're discussing this. So it seems like free will, not just for laypersons, but also for judges, is something that they take into account when they think about, should we hold this person accountable? Should he get this sentence or that sentence? So using this connection between voluntary, involuntary, not guilty, and then whether he has the ability to choose or not. So to me, fascinating stuff. Not sure, finally, if they made the right decision or not, but at least for North Carolina, this is how this case ended. The question is, why is this important? Because every once in a while, also in Hong Kong, people do some crazy stuff. So in the US, this happens almost every month, unfortunately. This guy went into a movie theater, shot 12 people, injured 70 in Denver. And then finally, when he was brought to court, what did he say? He pleaded insanity. What does insanity mean? I did not choose to do this. No normal person would ever do something like this. It wasn't me. It was my other person. It was the insanity that drove me to do this. Therefore, you cannot hold me accountable for this. So there is this connection between free will and holding people accountable. And it's not just this guy, but you can see the number of times that people are not brought to jail or not executed because they pleaded insanity. So pleading insanity, or saying that you do not have free will, or that there's something, internal urges, needs, and desires overcome you, and then you don't have any ability to execute your own choice, is something that affects the jury. It enables mass murderers to just get away with things. So it's a big dilemma. Should we allow free will to come into consideration or not? Something for lawyers to discuss. It's something that it's inherent within every society, but at least we need to know how jurors are going to understand notions of free will. In the previous class, one of the students came to me and said, yeah, it's also regarding addiction. So what is addiction? Can we overcome addiction? Some people have more propensity towards addiction. So can we overcome this? Should they be held accountable if they have an addiction towards something? Big topics to discuss, heavy philosophical notions, but at least we need to understand how people think about these things, from the layperson's jurors all the way to the Supreme Court judges. So what I like about this case is that it really summarizes everything that has to do with my research on free will. So there's some kind of an assumption that free will exists for most people, that for some people are driven by some other things that take free will away from them. So there is some link between free will and accountability. And then free will is regarding the level of choice. And then we have internal constraints, like if somebody is drunk or if somebody is insane, was overcome by all kinds of things, voices in their head. External, so cops taking you with handcuffs. He didn't want to go to jail and bring the drugs with him, but he was taken there. So all these things suddenly come into reality. All the things that we do in research can be seen in decisions like the Supreme Court from North Carolina. So to me, very, very interesting stuff. It links to another big philosopher that you might have heard of, Nietzsche. So he argues, he's a cynic, and he does not like free will. And he thinks that free will was just invented so that we can punish people. So if you take away free will, then we don't punish people as harshly. So men are considered to be free, just so that they might be judged and punished. So he's offering a completely different way of thinking about moral accountability that is not related to free will. So lots of philosophers from the beginning of time until now are trying to debate what is this link between free will and moral accountability. And just tying back to our results from before, you can really see that it has an impact on responsibility. So interesting stuff. So now we come back to what is this free will? What is it for? And I have to say that my opinion on this really changed. On one side, we've got Dennett, unfortunately passed away this year, a big philosopher. Some people are saying the biggest philosopher in our time, covered everything. Elbow Room is one of the, like a very fundamental reading in philosophy. So on one side, you've got the philosophers arguing free will is only worth having. What is it for? It's only worth having if it gives you what it is that you want. So I want to eat ice cream, I go and I eat ice cream. I want to go to class, I go to class. I do what I want. This is what free will is for. This is what most people think of free will as. And then you've got on the other side, you've got Baumeister that says something almost counterintuitive. It says free will is for following rules. So people choose to follow rules because inherently we're animals. We just want to take care of ourselves, have all these urges, needs, our desires. We just want to eat all day, sleep all day, have sex all day. This is what we want. But we're social animals. We want to follow rules so that we can coexist in society. So actually, free will is not for doing what you want. It's for doing what society wants, for you to coexist with others in society. So it's a very interesting debate between the social psychologists that look at the social context and some of the big philosophers. So I want to give you a sense of who these people are. So I'm going to play some videos for you, just so you can see them talk about things. And as they talk about things, you can also, I think what's also important is first how they phrase things. So they have a lot of experience, decades of talking about these notions, and they have a way of simplifying things. So they do this really well. But what's interesting, sometimes he's looking at the host and how he's reacting to all of this. And especially this host, I know him, he's done a bunch of series on philosophy stuff. He has very concrete views on many of these issues, and it's interesting to see how he reacts to others when they challenge him to reconsider his views. So we'll start with Baumeister here, and then I'll show you a little bit of Daniel Dennett.
Free will assumes personal agency. Free will and moral responsibility are intertwined in a kind of descriptive circularity. How to escape the circle? One way is to see that free will and moral responsibility do not exist in isolation. Interpersonal, social, and cultural factors play crucial roles. That's why I go back to Florida State University to meet social psychologist Roy Baumeister.
Well, in very plain terms, the idea of free will is that the person could act differently. A moral judgment is essentially a judgment about should that person have acted differently. The same with a legal judgment, that should the person have done something else rather than rob the liquor store. Mm-hmm. So the judgment that the person should act differently is based on the assumption that the person could act differently. Mm-hmm. So to my thinking, at least in this very simple sense of free will, that is essential to moral responsibility. Now, the argument goes the other way too. Why did we evolve free will? Why we develop that capacity? The ability to act morally is one of the crucial things that makes us human, that enables us to function well. One of the most basic norms is reciprocity. All other cultures do. If you do something to me, I should do it back to you. That's a kind of moral idea. But to control our behavior by it and actually pay someone back for something they've done for us, that requires a sense of moral responsibility, requires that higher mentality. It makes culture work, but it makes it possible. Sense of fairness is another thing that is fairly universal in human cultures. So developing this better sense of moral responsibility was crucial for our developing of culture, and goes with this new way of controlling our behaviors that I think goes by the name free will.
So let's look at these two categories of ideas.
I'm going to stop here. I'm going to switch to Daniel Dennett.
I recall how philosopher Daniel Dennett put it to me.
People want to know about free will. They want to protect free will, and so they should. It's very important. If the world is undetermined, it's just as hard to see how you could have free will that mattered, because you want to determine what you do. It's really interesting that we use this word determined, and mainly it's a term of praise. We say, she's so determined, and so we should. We want to determine our actions, but we don't want us to be determined in the determining of our actions. Now, I think that...
Right, Dan. I do not want to be determined. I want to determine my own thoughts and actions. I want to be able to do otherwise than that which I do. But if I cannot do otherwise, then would free will be an illusion? Would there be consequences?
It's interesting to hear him reflect about this. He's a libertarian, so he has very specific views about free will. And it's interesting seeing him go between different philosophers and social psychologists and how he responds to each one of those. But definitely there's something inherent about us that wants us to believe that we have free will, because otherwise, like, what's the point? If I can't be in control, then what's the meaning of all of this? So we almost need to have free will so that we can explain to ourselves what is it that we do in this world. So very interesting concepts of this. to wrap up the free will part of experimental philosophy, how experimental philosophy started, I'll introduce one more person to you, Eddie. And he's the one who started with these vignettes about universe A, universe B. He's the one that, together with Sean Nichols and Josh Knobe, started this whole movement. So very interesting to see how they interact here between them. Still the same host.
Eddie, I love philosophy, and I love the arguments, the analytical arguments that go violently across many topics. But recently, this whole area of experimental philosophy is getting a lot of interest. You're one of the pioneers in the field. I'd like to understand how it works, and is there any real significance to it? Because I'm a bit of a skeptic.
Yeah. I am too sometimes. So I started doing experimental philosophy with some of my students at Florida State, and we were just trying to test a very simple thing: whether or not philosophers are right when they say things like, well, ordinary people think free will is incompatible with determinism, or when you expose your students to determinism, they immediately think that rules out free will. And other philosophers, compatibilists, will say, no, commonsensically, free will and determinism can work together. And so we thought, well, why don't we test it, since they're making claims about what people actually say? And so we developed surveys where we explain determinism in the survey, and we say that,
Which is that everything has a cause, goes back as long as you want.
That's right. And we tried different ways of explaining it. So in one, you have a supercomputer. We say, imagine in the future we have a supercomputer that knows all the laws of nature, and if it can see what the universe is like at a particular time, it can predict what will happen in the future.
Okay.
And it predicts in 50 years, before this guy is born, that in another 50 years he'll rob a bank at this particular time. As usual, as always, the supercomputer is right. And then the question is this guy free in robbing the bank? Did he have free will? And is he morally responsible? Is he blameworthy? And what we found is actually most people said yes. They didn't think that this deterministic universe ruled out free will. We tried it in other ways. Well, what if you had a universe that you rewind and run over and over? Every time you start from the same initial conditions, the same laws of nature, the same thing happens, as a deterministic universe would be. Would people have free will in that universe? Most people said yes. So we began to think maybe ordinary people aren't afraid of determinism, as it were. Other people, like Josh Knobe and Sean Nichols, have tried other experiments and gotten slightly conflicting results. So more recently, with one of my students, Dylan Murray, we tried to see, well, what exactly is going on here? And we designed questions to see how people are interpreting the deterministic scenarios. And some of the questions were things like, in this universe, do people's desires have any effect on what they end up doing? Do people's beliefs have any effect on what they end up doing?
And so this gets us a little bit closer to social psychology. But what you can see over here is he's a philosopher. He's not familiar with social psychology experiments, but he understands the need, rather than assuming that people are going to answer a certain way, to just ask them how this thing is. And even when they give you a certain answer, you need to come up with more vignettes in order to ask different aspects of this. So maybe the scenario was not clear enough about the French fries. So maybe we should introduce a supercomputer that can predict everything. And then it gets into some of the Hollywood movies about if somebody can be predicted to rob a bank, and there's a 100% chance, the supercomputer says 100% chance that they're going to rob a bank. Should you let the person rob a bank, or should you arrest the person before that? So you post these vignettes to people, and then you learn something very fundamental about them. I'll just move on a little bit further to...
With experimental philosophy, we can try and figure out what psychological processes are leading people to think the things they think, and why they might be making errors. So we can develop an error theory for other people's philosophical beliefs. And in my case, I think I've got an error theory for people like you, libertarians, about free will.
Well, I certainly can use all the error correction that you can come up with, that's for sure. But what you're doing, though, would have real impact if it could help philosophers think. Is that a reality, or they'd be too arrogant to accept your analysis?
Well, I mean, we disagree among ourselves, of course, but actually I found it very helpful in clarifying the issues in my own mind, because if I have to try to set up surveys or experiments to ask ordinary people what they think about free will, I have to make sure that I'm making it as clear as possible. And that often helps me sort of see what the issues are.
Yeah, so I like this very much because it really resembles my own journey. I wanted to understand free will a little bit better. And then by me having to do experiments about this and posing questions and vignettes about free will to others, I kind of have a better understanding of what is it exactly that I believe in and how I perceive the universe. And it's an evolving realization. So at the beginning, I had certain views, then I refined them. I went back and forth between them. So being embedded with a discussion with all these big philosophers and big thinkers in social psychology allows me to better understand the notions of free will and understand my views of the world. So I really like this kind of discussion between them and how they kind of are very open to this, he wants all the error control that he can get in order to make sure that his beliefs are held in reality and are well informed. So there's more coming up. I'm going to introduce you to something called the knob effect or the side effect. So classic, another classic. But before we do this, I'm going to give you a 5-minute break. So go take 5 minutes, come back, and we'll do this one. All right, so we've got Chairman A and Chairman B. Chairman A, listen to the scenario and understand what is the side effect. So the vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board and says, we are thinking of starting a new program. It will help us increase profits, and it will also help the environment. The chairman of the board answered, I don't care about helping the environment. I only want to increase profits, right? So I want to have as many profits as I can. And then they start the program, and sure enough, what happens? The environment was helped. So then we ask people, so given this scenario, what do you think about the chairman? Should the chairman be applauded, praised for his actions that led to the positive outcomes for the environment? So think about this. How much should we give the chairman the credit for helping the environment, even though the only thing he cared about are profits? Second scenario is very, very similar. However, in this case, it was about harming the environment. So exactly the same, goes to the chairman, and then he says it will help us increase profits, but it will also harm the environment. And then the chairman of the board answers, I don't care about harming the environment. I just want to increase profits. And then finally, what happened? They increased the profits, implemented the program, but the environment was harmed. And then we asked exactly the same question. So should the chairman be criticized for his actions that led to the negative outcomes? So think for a second. Which one do you think? Praise versus blame? Does it change anything? So I already touched a little bit about judgment and decision making and behavioral economics, and we talked a little bit about Kahneman, thinking fast and slow, and then we have prospect theory, the changes between gains and losses. So there's something going on over here, but here it's a side effect. It's not even related to what the chairman was actually trying to do. So how do people actually react to this thing? So I'll introduce you to Josh Knobe. And Josh Knobe is like an uprising star in experimental philosophy. He does a lot of things. He is one of the founders of experimental philosophy, and he's very good at explaining these kinds of things, very engaging kind of way. And he challenges the same host, in regards to the way that he answers this scenario.
Josh, I love philosophy. I love to try to understand what it's all about. You tell me something new called experimental philosophy. That sounds like a contradiction. How do you have experimental philosophy?
Well, experimental philosophy is actually kind of continuing in a really long tradition of philosophy. So the way philosophers often think about certain questions is by constructing thought experiments. So if Plato is interested in trying to understand, say, what courage is, he'll construct a certain story and then ask the reader, so would you say that that is courage? What experimental philosophers do is they take those thought experiments but actually bring them to the people and ask people in systematic experimental studies what they think about these thought experiments. Is this thing actually courage? Is it not? And so forth.
Okay, what's an example?
Well, one of the earliest studies that I did was about the question what it is to do something intentionally. So if you're wondering, what it is to do something on purpose versus not on purpose, one way you can figure this out is just by going through some cases and seeing, would we say this is on purpose and would we say that's not on purpose? So I just did a simple study to begin with that was just conducted actually on people just hanging out in a park. And they were randomly assigned to get one of two versions. So here's a first version of the story. Imagine the vice president of a company goes to the chairman of the board and he says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, but it's also going to harm the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know this is going to harm the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So let's implement the policy. They implement the policy, and sure enough, it harms the environment.
And it makes money.
And it makes money.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the question. Did he harm the environment intentionally? So what do you think?
I might say no, but other people I would think because it has a negative effect, there might be an emotion to say yes.
Yeah, sure enough. If you try this, more than 80% of people say, yeah, he harmed the environment intentionally. And if you ask them why they say that, they say, well, it's just because he knew he was going to harm the environment, and then he just went ahead and did it anyway.
Yeah, there's certain logic to that.
But then we thought maybe there's something going on here further, something that goes beyond just the fact that he knew it. And then we were thinking in particular, maybe it's the fact that people think that harming the environment is bad. So we decided to construct another case that was exactly the same, except for we just changed the word harm to help. So the vice president goes to the chairman of the board, and he says, okay, we've got this new policy. It's going to make huge amounts of money for our company, and it's also going to help the environment. And the chairman of the board says, look, I know it's going to help the environment, but I don't care at all about that. All I care about is just making as much money as we possibly can. So they implement the policy, and sure enough, it helps the environment. Did he help the environment intentionally? Yeah, there, overwhelmingly people say no.
No,
But it
right.
seems so strange because if you think about what it is to do something intentionally, you think it has nothing to do with whether it's good or bad.
And the words you used were exactly the same, except one was harm and one was help. Every word was the same. His attitude, his personality, what happened, everything was exactly the same.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
the difference is an enormous difference, not a close difference.
Right, it's 80 something in one condition say yes, and in the other condition 20 something say yes, 20%.
Yeah, and then
Yeah, 80-20. So 80% say should be held accountable for this if it's a negative outcome, and 20% say that he should be praised if this is a positive outcome. So very, very interesting. We can go back to this and say we have like 9 responses here. I don't know how this is gonna look, but in general, there is a little bit of a gap between blame and praise. So blame is a little bit higher. I'm not sure this is statistically significant, but what's already interesting is that this is already above 0, which is the main point. So giving some credit both to praise and to blame when it's harmed or helped, even though it's just a side effect, and the chairman said, I don't really care about that. So lots of interesting things. You can contrast between the praise and the blame, but you can also see if it deviates from the 0, whether it's on the left side or on the right side. So that's already interesting. We can do a lot of things with this. So knob effect, side effect started from that scenario. Then it went further to a lot of different scenarios to understand how people think about intentionality. And we've done a bunch of different things with this. So this is the vignette. With help. I ran this in the classroom, Fundamentals of Social Psychology in 2020. I had like 70 different people, and you can see the contrast is even bigger, about twice as much in blame than in praise. And then I decided, together with some of my co-authors, to try and take these 2 paradigms, the free will paradigm that started everything, and the side effect, the knob effect, and try to marry these together to try and understand whether they complement one another, exist independently of each other. And just this week, we got this accepted into a journal, even though it started from a very long time ago, closer to my PhD. So it's about to come out. So I'll just show you what it is that we did. So first is control condition. So here you can see the differences between harm and help. So not only can I replicate this in Fundamentals of Social Psychology and a little bit with you, but also you can see the contrast between the harm condition, 180 people, compared to the help, 182. What is the Cohen's d, Hedges g? It's 2.04. That's a gigantic effect. That's very, very, very large, much larger than what we typically expect in judgment decision making in social psychology. So it's already something that shows support replicability of the side effect. But then we also ran the same thing again. We ran the chairman A versus chairman B in a deterministic or indeterministic universe. So we said, let's say that this happens in a universe where there is determinism or there isn't determinism and so forth. And you can see that in a deterministic universe, actually the gap really narrows. So you can see that the effect over here is, instead of 2.0, it's 0.78. So it seems like the intentionality or the praise, the moral accountability, praise or blame, really narrow down when there's determinism. So it seems like both of these are happening at the same time. And when we look at the indeterministic universe, when we look at this side over here, then we can see that actually in an indeterministic universe that allows for some kind of free will, then the gap even becomes wider with a Cohen's g of 2.23. So it's just interesting to see both of these married together and see that they're acting independently of each other, but also there's a little bit of interaction. So just to see that there is replicability, the control condition is much closer to the free will, the indeterministic universe. And when we have a deterministic universe, it affects the way that the knob effect happens, that the side effect happens. So that's one thing. So we look at praise and blame. So this is moral accountability, but we also added a bunch of other extensions. So here, for example, you can see free will, attribution of free will. So what's nice about this is that we can see that even in a control condition, when we compare the harm and help, there is an association with free will. So in order to hold the person accountable for harm, free will is already very, very high, but it's especially high when there's a negative outcome. So free will goes even further. So attributions of free will go up when there's something negative that happens. So I have another paper that says the title is Bad is Freer Than Good. In order to hold people accountable when something bad happens, we also believe that they have more free will so that we can hold them accountable for their actions. And this gap kind of narrows down in indeterministic. So you can see that there's really like a big gap in free will attribution. So seeing the knob effect also applied to free will attributions is really interesting, a nice demonstration. So anything else, any other scenarios that we can determine, do stuff in experimental philosophy? Actually, there's lots of those. And I really like this upcoming one because one of my favorite movies from Hollywood, my all-time favorite, is The Matrix. So in this Matrix, we have Neo, who is a hacker, and one day realizes there's something very wrong about the universe he's living in, and he tries to go deeper and deeper, and then he discovers that actually he lives in a simulation, and he's offered the opportunity to wake up from the simulation and go back to real life, whatever real life is, where people are used as batteries in order to used for power by given sleep to be in this simulated world. So should you wake up from this reality or not? So that's another thing that experimental philosophers do. They give you vignettes to try to imagine that you're living in a simulation. Would you want to wake up, or would you want to be plugged into a simulation if it gives you eternal happiness and you're going to be a multimillionaire? Do you want to be in that? So I think back when Matrix came out, this was a hypothetical. Nobody can envision a technology that would allow you to do this. But nowadays, we've got VR that's getting very, very close to that. I think in a couple of decades, we'll have the ability to just like see a reality or experience a reality. And then it's a question like, how do we know how far along we are? Are we in the simulation? Are we in the real world? Sometimes when you wake up from a dream, sometimes you ask yourself, wait, am I in reality now? Am I in a dream? So we've got movies about this in Hollywood, like Inception, right? So a lot of very deep philosophical questions. And there's a lot of people who are actually trying to study whether we are in a simulation right now. Is this all constructed for us? Is there a way to know if we are in a simulation, So you can do a bunch of really cool stuff on this. So I'll just give you one example on experimental philosophy, taking this to demonstrate what we can do with these kinds of thought experiments.
Hi, I'm Joshua Nobe from Yale University, and today I'm going to be talking about a new approach to philosophy that is sometimes called experimental philosophy. The basic idea behind experimental philosophy is that we might be able to make some philosophical progress by actually going out and running systematic experimental studies, much like the experiments people usually run in social psychology or in cognitive science. Now you might be thinking, how could running a study like that ever help us make any progress in philosophy? After all, philosophy isn't supposed to be about how people ordinarily think. It is supposed to be about figuring out which answers to these questions are actually the right ones. This is definitely exactly the right question to be asking, but experimental philosophers claim that by running these studies, we can get some valuable insight into why people have the thoughts they do. And if we understand why people typically have the thoughts they do, we might be able to get a better sense of whether we should be putting our trust in those thoughts or just dismissing them. There's a lot of controversy about whether this approach can ever actually work, but I thought it might be good just to give you a quick example so that you can make up your mind for yourself. The experimental philosopher Philippe de Brigard recently ran a series of experiments to investigate the way people ordinarily think about a famous philosophical thought experiment called the experience machine. His idea was that if we could get a better understanding of what is going on in our minds when we hear this thought experiment, we might be in a better position to figure out whether our thoughts about it are correct or incorrect. Now, the experience machine thought experiment goes like this. Imagine that in the future, there are super-duper neuroscientists, and these neuroscientists are able to create a machine that can stimulate your brain in such a way that you think you're having a truly amazing life. So if you enter the machine, you will think you are accomplishing extraordinary things, that you're having deep and fulfilling relationships, and that everyone admires and respects you. But you won't really be doing anything at all. In real life, you'll just be a person lying in a vat of water somewhere, being stimulated to believe that all these amazing things are happening. Now comes the question, would you go into the machine? Most people say that they wouldn't, and philosophers sometimes start with this basic thought and use it as part of an argument for the conclusion that there's more to life than just experiencing happiness, that there's something important about being connected up in the right way to reality. But de Brigard thought that maybe there was more to this story, so he conducted an experiment in which participants were given a case we might call the reverse experience machine. The reverse experience machine case goes like this. Imagine you are going about your ordinary life when one day you get a visit from a mysterious man named Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith explains to you that this whole life you think you've been leading, with all your supposed friends, your accomplishments, even your mother and father, is simply an illusion. A number of years ago, you encountered some super-duper neuroscientists, and they offered to put you into an experience machine where you would be stimulated to believe that you had exactly this life you think you've been having. Now you face a question. If you'd like, you can leave the machine and go back to your real life. Or, if you'd prefer, you can stay inside the machine, and the neuroscientists will erase any memory you have of the visit from Smith. So think about it for a moment. What would you do? When de Brigard framed the thought experiment in this reversed way, he found that most people actually said they wanted to stay in the machine. So now it seems that we have learned something important about ourselves, and that we might want to reevaluate the conclusion we drew from the original version. When we were just thinking about that original version, we had a particular intuition, and that intuition led us, as part of a complex philosophical argument, to arrive at a certain conclusion about what was truly important in life. But now it seems that we've acquired some new knowledge about the psychological processes that made us have that intuition in the first place. We learned that these processes aren't just sensitive to the difference between reality and illusion. They also leave us with a strong tendency to stick with whatever sort of life we've already got. So, now that you've learned this new fact about how people think, would you still arrive at the same conclusion from the experience machine thought experiment?
It's really interesting that philosophical notion that people had before when philosophical philosophers were discussing this among themselves by posing this to people and trying to vary the vignette, sometimes use the opposite kind of vignette. Actually, we learn something new. So here, instead of assuming people and how they answer and assuming people's intuition that they care about authenticity, actually by posing these many types of vignettes, sometimes counter to one another, then we can gain some new insights regarding the world and how people think about it. So that's interesting. It's a very interesting paper. It's also interesting how he framed this kind of vignette. We're not going to go over this, but this dilemma between remaining connected or going back to reality. And he also varied negativity, positivity. So for example, in the negative vignette, by the way, you may want to know that your real life is not at all as you simulated life. In reality, you're a prisoner in a maximum security prison in West Virginia. So if you wake up from the simulated reality, you're going to go back to being a prisoner. So a negative one. In the positive one, by the way, you may want to know that your real life is not at all like your simulated life. In reality, you're a multi-millionaire artist living in Monaco. What would you choose? So you can play with this with all sorts of different ways. And what's interesting is like in this final one, so in the negative one, people are like, of course they don't want to go back to being a prisoner. So they want to remain in the box and they don't want to go back. But even in the positive, like you're being offered the chance to wake up from the simulated and go back to being a multi-millionaire in Monaco. Surely everybody would want to do that. But no, actually, it's like a 50-50 here in the positive and the neutral. So very interesting to see how people react to this. So that is the only way to know how people will react is actually pose that to them. Never assume what you're going to get back from your participants. And then they pose this like another different way. You can disconnect, but you may want to know that your life outside is not at all. So they don't tell them if it's positive or negative. It's just a control condition. What would people do? And you can see that it's about the same. So interesting. Like almost everything in this course, one of the main questions that I would pose to you is like, before I want to show this to you, I want to know, does this replicate? Does this hold? Is this solid? Something that you can communicate to others? So I can tell you from my own experience that experimental philosophy is definitely in almost everything that we did, we found similar effect. So this really seems to hold, but we want some systematic evidence. So actually, this group of philosophers, and you can see some familiar names here. So for example, where is he? Josh Knobe is here. And a bunch of other people that I know and I collaborate with and published with are here. So they conducted a lot of replications of a lot of different scenarios from all over. And up here you can have the Shaw-Nichols, the free will experiments, the side effect. So you can see all of these. The replicability is very, very high. So they have three different categories: the content-based, context-based, and demographic effects. We can take out the demographic effects. It's more like a psychology-related traits and all that. But when it comes to content-based, the vignettes that we just saw right now, replicability is very high. It's 90%. It's very close to perfect. So it's very, very interesting. And the effects are about the same. So if the original was 0.41, then the replications were 0.39. So actually, experimental philosophy, when we compare domains, so we've got social psychology, and we've got economics, and we've got biology, and all that. Experimental philosophy, maybe because it's a new domain, has very high replicability. So they do some really good work, and they try as much as possible to share all their vignettes, the materials, the data, and the code. So interesting stuff, and quite well done with a strong group of philosophers using social psychology methods. So this is also a little bit large, but I'm going to simplify this for you. The question here is the following. Let's say that somebody went through a car accident and needs to go through a brain surgery. And when they try to treat him, they put in a chip that tries to help him regain his abilities. And he goes back to being the same person, aside from one factor. One factor changed. So we've got agnosia. So he can see perfectly. I'll just read this to you. So he lost his ability to recognize objects. He can see perfectly fine, but his ability to identify objects has disappeared. So the question is this the same person or not the same person? Second thing is apathy. He's the same in every regard aside from one. He has lost all of his desires. He no longer wants or desires anything. So is this the same person or not the same person? And then morality. He lost his moral conscience. He's no longer capable of judging right from wrong or being moved by suffering of others. Is this the same person or not? And finally, one that we added, same. So the person is the same in everything aside from one. He lost his faith in God. He no longer goes to church or no longer commits to religious activities. Is this the same person or not? So you can think about this. Of all these, to what extent is this the same kind of person? I'll give you a second. I'll just tell you that this is a classic study by Nina and Sean here. And these are the main findings. So you can see that when it comes to all of these different things, the degree of identity change, how much of it the identity changed when each one of these was changed. So this is a control condition, just went through brain surgery, how much did this person change? Agnosia compared to apathy, compared to amnesia, compared to morality. So you can see that even though these are big changes, losing apathy for others, so losing any kind of interest in anything or desires is a big thing, but people don't feel like this is the essential self. What is the strongest factor where if this changes, it means that the person is different? It's about morality. So the main takeaway from this is that the essential self is about morality. So morality is one of the biggest things that if changed, then we consider the person to be a different person. So this is already something that's very interesting. A person who took this class like you came to me after class and said, this is really interesting. I really like this kind of thing. And I want to do research on this. Can we do a thesis on this together? And I'm like, yeah, I'd love to. What's interesting for you? What would you like to try? And then he wanted to try and beat morality. He wanted to find something that is more essential to the self than morality. So he thought maybe religion. So maybe if we add religion to it, if somebody loses their religion, they stop going to church or they change religion altogether, maybe that will beat morality. So I really like this idea. Then we thought together what might be even stronger than this. Maybe if not religion, maybe the person is not religious or people don't care about religion. How about political ideology? So maybe in Hong Kong less so, but definitely in our sample in the US, people really care about, Republicans versus Democrats. If somebody changes from being a Republican to a Democrat, maybe this is a loss of identity. Maybe something is very meaningful happening there. So we did this. First, I'll show you the results from this replication that we did in classroom. So 2021, you can see that morality is the lowest over here. So definitely morality seems to be the critical factor over here. Let's see what it is that you had. Apathy, morality. So apathy beat morality by a little bit. Okay. But then when we ran this as a pre-registered replication, you can see over here that we added political ideology. So we had control, agnosia, and then religion that we thought maybe would beat morality, did not beat morality. Ideology came very close to morality, but still number one winner by far is morality. So we tried to beat morality, but we couldn't. So actually this ended up being a successful application. Plus we now understand a little bit better where ideology and religion is. So this is a good example for what I consider to be a very high quality thesis project where somebody sees something in class, they think this is interesting, they want to play a little bit with philosophy, they want to pose vignettes, they come to me, and we do this as a pre-registered application. And you can actually see that many of these effects are quite strong. When it comes to morality, we're getting all the way to 1.41 when compared to desire. So definitely a lot of signal and consistent, sometimes weaker, sometimes larger. Finally, the true self.
Hi, I'm Josh Nobe. I'm a professor at Yale University, and I'm going to be talking about the notion of a true self. So let's begin with a classic case of a conflict between belief and emotion. Imagine a man named Mark who has a belief that homosexuality is a sin. So he thinks that it's morally wrong for people to be with others of the same sex, and in fact, he travels the world preaching this message and teaching people techniques they can use to resist same-sex attraction. But now, imagine that Mark has a problem. Mark's problem is that he himself is actually gay. So on a kind of emotional, visceral level, he's drawn to be with other men. As a result, Mark is feeling a conflict between his beliefs and his emotions. And the question I want to ask now is, which of those two aspects of him is his true self? Which is the part that really reveals who he himself most truly is deep down inside? So here, different people might have different views. Some people might say, ultimately, your true self is constituted by your beliefs, by your reasoning, by your abstract thinking. So they might say, Mark's true self is a part of him that says that homosexuality is a sin. But then other people might have exactly the opposite view. They might say, your true self is constituted by your emotions, by your visceral desires, by your passions. And then they might say, Mark's true self is the part of him that's drawn toward being with another man. So I was talking about this question with two of my colleagues, George Newman and Paul Bloom, and we began thinking, maybe people's ordinary notion of the true self doesn't really fit with either of these two conceptions. Instead, maybe people's ordinary notion of the true self is shaped in a really fundamental way by their value judgments. So maybe, when people are thinking about your true self, what they do is to think about which aspect of yourself is the valuable one, the good one, the one worth preserving. So to see whether this is right, we conducted an experimental study. One group of participants was just given the exact case of Mark that I just gave to you. But then we wanted to know whether people's value judgments affected people's answers to this question. So we recruited two different groups of participants, liberal participants and conservative participants. And what we found was a striking difference. So the conservative participants tended to say that Mark's belief was part of his true self. that his belief that homosexuality was morally wrong was in some sense the voice of his true self speaking to him. The liberals tended to say exactly the opposite. They said that that belief was not part of his true self, and that his true self was actually constituted by his emotions or his desires or his passions, the part of him that was drawing him to be with another man. So looking just at that first result, you get at least some evidence that people's judgments about the true self are in some way shaped by their value judgments. But to see whether this is really true, we recruited a separate group of participants who received the reverse of that first case. So these group of participants were told about a person who believes that people of all sexual orientations should be treated equally. So he thinks that it's morally wrong to in any way discriminate against gay people. And in fact, he travels the world preaching this message and teaching people techniques they can use to resist their prejudice against homosexuals. However, this person has a problem. His problem is that he himself has these negative emotions toward gay people. So he himself finds himself feeling disgust toward homosexuals. And as a result, he also is faced with an inner conflict, a conflict between his beliefs and his emotions. Here too, we find a difference, but this time it's in the opposite direction, as it were. So the liberal participants tend to say his belief that people of all sexual orientations should be treated equally, that is the voice of his true self speaking to him. By contrast, the conservative participants say that belief isn't his true self at all. His true self is revealed by this emotion he has, this disgust toward gay people. So looking now at the
So it's quite amazing. At the beginning, you run one scenario, and then you think, what is happening here? Is there a way to investigate this? You run one scenario, and you think you have some insight, but then if you do just the opposite scenario, then maybe you can see how it works in interaction. So they ran this, Newman et al. 2011, and we did this as a registered report. So Janet over here did this as a thesis with me. We submitted this as a registered report. So actually very, very successful. And you can see over here, like lots of signals, a little bit smaller sometimes, a little bit larger sometimes. Actually, the effects here are very, very large for this interaction. It was relatively smaller, but we got like, I don't know, almost 10 times more of an effect than they did in the original. So it's nice to see when stuff like that really holds up, even in a different, as Republicans and Democrats get even more separated from each other. So very interesting research about true self. So we've covered a lot of topics from free will to the essential moral self to the true self, covering the side effect, intentionality, moral accountability, a lot of really interesting topics. The final video I want to show you is Will McCaskill. So Will McCaskill is a big figure in effective altruism. And he, a very young person, followed Peter Singer and the stuff that we started the course with, trying to implement the principles that Peter Singer raised from the girl in the pond, would you save that girl or not, to trying to use philosophy in order to affect the real world. So we think of philosophy as being very disconnected. We think about social psychology as being all these vignettes and judgment decision making. Doesn't really have any impact on the world. But he is a good example for a philosopher that started a movement that is really doing some good in the world. So as the last video, to summarize all of this and summarize the entire course together from the beginning, from Peter Singer all the way up to now with experimental philosophy, here is Will McCaskill in The Daily Show with Trevor Noah when he was still the host, I think 2 years ago. Keeps on going. It's a very interesting interview. I recommend that you watch all of this. But I really like that the way that he answers is by posing a vignette from experimental philosopher and saying, just imagine what would happen if you would have something that would shatter in the glass. How would you think about this of impacting somebody in the long term, in the short term? Does it really matter? So as an experimental philosopher, he really knows how to pose this to people that it would make sense to them, that they would understand the point behind a movement like effective altruism. So many of the things that we're doing in Project 3 that I'm really looking forward to seeing what you've done is to try and help make sense of this, posing all these vignettes, comparison, charity A, charity B, in order for us to gain some insights about psychological factors to help people understand how to think about the world, how to think about fundamental issues like altruism. So we've gone through a lot in this class. I'll just repeat that next week is voluntary. You can decide if you want to join or not. What we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about your future self and your careers when you graduate. What are you going to do? What kind of an impact do you want to have? So just like Will McCaskill here, he decided based on his studies that instead of going down the path of just being just another philosopher or just doing something ordinary, he's going to try and build something a little bit bigger than that. So we're going to talk about this using some of the tools that Effective Altruism offers with 80,000 hours. And you're welcome to do this with us. If you want, you can join the other session if something is happening during this time next week. If you can't today, I'm also doing this with judgment decision making tomorrow, Thursday, so you can join that. So it's up to you which one you want to join. If you want to join, I'll be happy to see you. If you're not coming, then I just want to say thank you for going through this journey with me. I've learned a lot from you looking at your project 1, project 2. I really appreciate you engaging with me in this class, sitting together. I know that some of the tasks were not exactly what you were hoping to do. Maybe some of those took you out of your comfort zone. But I feel like we all grew together. We learned something new about this class. So at least for me, I'm very grateful. So thank you for taking this course. And I look forward to seeing you either next week or throughout Hong Kong U. If you see me and you notice me, want to say hi, I'm very happy to talk to you. Okay. So thank you.